we're going to hear from Gino DiStagio and Betty Adele from Winnipeg. Gino is at the University of Winnipeg. He's the Vice President of Research and Innovation. And Betty Adele is with End Homelessness in Winnipeg. So we'll get going. So the floor is all yours, Victoria. Thank you.
Alrighty. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you everyone for attending today. I'd like to welcome you to my presentation on a study called Examining Harm Reduction in Housing First for Youth Experiencing Homelessness and Concurrent Mental Health and Substance Use Issues. Quite a mouthful, but I'll go through it. So here's just a quick overview of what you can expect from today's session. I'll begin by outlining the key objectives and goals that I hope you take away from this presentation. Next, we'll delve into the background and purpose of this study, which focused on harm reduction within Housing First for Youth programming and the methods used to examine this topic, specifically in a Housing First for Youth program in Kelowna, BC. Then I'll present the results of this study, which identify both the facilitators and barriers to harm reduction delivery within the Housing First for Youth program. And based on these findings, we'll discuss some recommendations for future research and service delivery. Lastly, before I end off, I'll briefly discuss the changes that have been implemented in the Kelowna site based on the insights gained from this study. But before we get started, while I appreciate Tim's acknowledgement of the land where we gather today, I also wish to acknowledge the land where I'm coming from and where this study took place. So in an effort to enact the...
I apologize. If anybody needs the correct headsets, I can't bring them to you, or I would. Piece of ID, but they're already at the bottom. That's the way they're to me. Okay.
So in an effort to enact the processes, of decolonization and truth and reconciliation, I make it my responsibility to acknowledge and recognize when I'm on colonized land. So with that in mind, I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge that as a student from Wilfrid Laurier University, I attend an institution that is located on the shared traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples, and I'm incredibly grateful to live, work, and study on these lands. Furthermore, this study was conducted on a Housing First for Youth program in Kelowna, BC, in partnership with the Canadian Mental Health Association Kelowna branch, whose offices are located on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Okanagan Nation and Syilx peoples. So as promised, there are 3 objectives for today's session. So the first one is to address a knowledge gap on the implementation of harm reduction in Housing First for Youth programming. The second one is to highlight factors promoting and limiting harm reduction delivery in a Housing First for Youth program for youth experiencing homelessness and concurrent mental health and substance use issues. And lastly, to discuss some actionable recommendations for future Housing First research, service delivery, and practice to not only improve harm reduction in Housing First for Youth, but also better support youth experiencing homelessness and substance use issues. So with those objectives in mind, we move into the background of the study that I'll be discussing today. As we all know, youth homelessness is a growing concern across Canada. According to the National Youth Homelessness Survey, youth between the ages of 13 to 24 account for approximately 20% of Canada's homeless population, representing between 35,000 to 40,000 young people experiencing homelessness each year, and I'm sure these numbers are much higher today. The experience of homelessness for many youth is often associated with an increased likelihood of mental health and substance use issues. However, due to stigma, age, and other restrictions on services, youth experience difficulty accessing and navigating mental health and addiction supports, as well as safe and affordable housing. Housing First for Youth is a youth-focused adaptation of the well-established Housing First program model to housing and service provision for individuals experiencing homelessness. Given that youth homelessness is associated with this increased likelihood of substance use issues, a central tenet of the Housing First for Youth framework is the use of a harm reduction approach when dealing with substance use and addictions. With core principles focused on targeting risks and harms, meeting people where they are at, and responding to substance use with dignity and compassion, harm reduction aims to reduce the risks and harmful effects associated with substance use without requiring abstinence. While there is considerable evidence demonstrating the effectiveness of harm reduction strategies with adults experiencing homelessness and substance use issues, use of these interventions with young people is largely under-researched and consequently underutilized or made inaccessible to youth. Similarly, despite the Housing First for Youth model guide calling for the use of harm reduction, research on Housing First for Youth programming has yet to examine how harm reduction is specifically being implemented in these settings, and knowledge on harm reduction implementation within adult Housing First programming is limited. So that leads us to the objective or research question that was guiding this study. And so this study aimed to examine how the principles and philosophies of harm reduction are operationalized or envisioned and defined by service providers and implemented or carried out and delivered in a Housing First for Youth program for youth experiencing homelessness and concurrent mental health and substance use issues. As a greater emphasis is placed on harm reduction as a core component of programs addressing homelessness, there is a greater need for an accurate description of what harm reduction truly looks like in the context of Housing First for Youth service delivery. It's important to note that this study is part of a larger ongoing evaluation of a 2-year Housing First for Youth research demonstration project for youth experiencing homelessness and concurrent disorders, and that's the Restart project here conducted by my supervisor, Dr. Mark Hurst, and that is conducted in Kelowna, BC and Toronto, Ontario. The Restart project utilizes both process and outcome evaluation to assess the effectiveness of a combined Housing First for Youth and integrated mental health and addiction intervention model. To examine the operationalization and implementation of harm reduction in Housing First for Youth, the study drew from the Restart project process evaluation interviews that occurred 12 months after program implementation in the Kelowna, BC site. In terms of research design, this study employed a triangulation design in which data were collected from multiple sources. In this case, it was qualitative interviews and document review, analyzed separately and then compared to develop a comprehensive understanding of how harm reduction was being delivered in the program. Program leaders and staff from various levels of the Restart program in Kelowna were recruited to take part in an individual interview. In total, 2 program leaders and 6 program staff responded to the recruitment call and were interviewed as part of this study. And in addition to those interviews, a review of 15 Restart program documents and case management materials was also conducted. Thematic analysis was conducted on the qualitative interview data to identify key themes surrounding how harm reduction was understood and delivered in the program by staff in Housing First for Youth. And then the program documents were analyzed using content analysis to examine how harm reduction was operationalized and implemented through the guiding tools and resources made available to staff for program delivery. And it was through these interviews and document review that several themes emerged, illustrating how harm reduction was delivered in the Restart program. So one of the most consistent themes surrounding harm reduction in Housing First for Youth to arise from this data was the concept of working with youth to ensure that they were using substances as safely as possible. So program staff reported doing this by 1, providing and supporting youth to access clean supplies, which we can see in this quote here, things like clean needles and clean cooking pots, reminding youth to use substances and alcohol safely and with others, things like that. Number 2, it was providing resources for overdose prevention, so that's specifically naloxone kits, as well as training on how to use them. 3, educating youth on safer substance use. And 4, creating safety plans to help youth navigate reducing harms to themselves and recognizing potential triggers that may lead to risk-taking behavior. Next, harm reduction was delivered by connecting youth to services in the community. So these services fell into 2 categories. The first one was connecting youth with opioid agonist therapy, or OAT, other treatment and detox when they were ready and when they specifically asked to be connected with these services. And 2, connecting youth to other health and social services in the community for mental health and substance use support. Providing youth with individualized support was the third theme surrounding harm reduction delivery to emerge from the data. So as we know, every young person is unique, and the harm reduction approach differed depending on the needs and goals of the youth being served by the Restart program. Staff individualized the support they provided youth by 1, establishing a clear picture of where youth were at in terms of their substance use. So as we see in this quote here, this involved facilitating conversations with youth to gain a comprehensive understanding of how they were doing, what their goals and needs were with their substance use, and how staff could best support them. And 2, adjusting the harm reduction approach to reflect the youth's needs, goals, and overall situation, for example, their age and their substance use history. As I've previously mentioned, the stigma surrounding substance use and harm reduction presents a major barrier to youth accessing supports and services for their substance use. Thus, the fourth theme to emerge from the data was that of reducing the stigma around substance use. And this was done by 1, operating from a non-judgmental standpoint, which allowed youth to share information with service providers without fear of punishment, and allowed staff to ensure that youth were using substances safely. And 2, facilitating open conversations around substance use, like we see in this quote here, where conversations with youth around drugs and substance use were encouraged, and there was no subject that was seen as taboo or off limits. The 5th major theme surrounding harm reduction and housing first for youth to emerge from the data entailed empowering youth who use substances. So as we know, youth experiencing homelessness and substance use issues also experience a profound disempowerment. As such, service providers aim to empower youth in the Restart program by 1, respecting and promoting youth choice surrounding substance use, rather than telling youth what they can and cannot do, as we see in this quote here. Involving youth in reducing harms to themselves, for example, when creating plans for safer substance use. And 3, client-directed care and treatment planning. In addition to mitigating the harms associated with substance use, harm reduction in the Restart program also entailed creating or placing youth in environments where the risk of harm was reduced. For example, when examining housing options with youth, program staff would conduct housing risk assessments to identify the potential substance use-related harms associated with the location, environment, and community youth would be moving into. And finally, while harm reduction is commonly viewed as a strategy for mitigating harms surrounding substance use, many service providers also identified harm reduction as a means for building stronger relationships with youth who use substances. By utilizing a harm reduction approach, participants were able to effectively engage youth and facilitate open conversations around substance use, strengthening the therapeutic relationship between staff and youth in the program. So in addition to those 7 themes that show us how harm reduction was operationalized and implemented in the Housing First for Youth program staff also identified systemic factors that challenge the delivery of harm reduction practices by limiting youth choice and consequently disempowering youth in the Restart program. So first, in addition to the general lack of housing availability and affordability in Kelowna, several participants identified the lack of low-barrier housing for youth with substance use issues as a barrier to harm reduction delivery. So when discussing housing availability in Kelowna, program staff identified scattered site rentals or market rentals and supportive housing units as housing options typically available to youth in the Restart program. However, affordable and appropriate rental options became very limited when it came to housing youth who were actively using substances. Several service providers discussed the challenges of navigating substance use policies and age restrictions of supportive housing buildings and the needs of youth to find adequate and appropriate housing. Additionally, the inclusion of crime-free housing statements and rental agreements, which explicitly state that substance use is not permitted in rental units, and narratives that some landlords would prefer tenants not use drugs, were cited as notable challenges for the Restart program. The findings also suggested that age presented a unique barrier to not only housing youth, but also to empowerment and subsequent harm reduction delivery. Specifically, the age of the youth mediated the extent to which youth choice and self-determination were promoted by service providers in response to substance use. Service providers took a more paternalistic approach with younger youth, which we can see in this quote here, attempting to mitigate substance use and facilitating conversations that wouldn't be held with older youth or adults in Housing First programming. This response to youth substance use creates tensions with the promotion of true youth choice and harm reduction in Housing First for Youth, and reinforces societal narratives that young people should not use drugs and are not fit to make decisions surrounding substance use. Now, before I move into recommendations, there are some limitations of this study to consider. Firstly, this study examined harm reduction in the context of one Housing First for Youth program in a small Canadian community. As such, the unique characteristics and contextual factors of the program may not be generalizable across all Housing First for Youth programs. However, these findings offer a starting point for other examinations of harm reduction in Housing First for Youth programming, as well as the opportunity for comparison with programs in other communities to identify broader systemic barriers to the implementation of harm reduction in Housing First for Youth across Canada. Similarly, there may be an opportunity for the comparison of findings with the Toronto site of the Restart project that I had mentioned earlier. However, due to a delayed start time and COVID, that comparison has not yet been possible. Another limitation of this study was that it relied solely on the perspectives of a small sample of program leaders and service providers. While the document review allowed for some triangulation of results, program staff may have presented themselves as implementing harm reduction better than their actual practice. This is a common limitation of research examining harm reduction in housing programs, as most studies focus exclusively on service providers' perspectives of utilizing harm reduction approach. Additionally, we have not yet captured the perspectives of program youth regarding the delivery of harm reduction services in the Restart program. While youth had not yet been interviewed as part of the process evaluation at the time of conducting this specific study due to COVID-19 restrictions and to avoid overburdening them with data collection, their perspectives will be captured as part of the project in both sites. And then, of course, due to COVID-19, service providers were incredibly busy, as I'm sure we all know, and many were not available to be interviewed, resulting in a smaller sample size than anticipated. Despite this, we were still able to speak with at least one program staff from every sector of the Restart program and reach saturation in the analysis, allowing for a comprehensive evaluation of service providers' perspectives. And then lastly, the nested nature of this study and incorporation of questions pertaining to harm reduction into existing interview guides may have limited the depth of exploration and analysis. But despite this, interview data still uncovered several ways in which harm reduction was delivered in the Housing First for Youth program and was supported by that document review. All right, so the part that I'm sure we're most interested in. So firstly, in terms of future Housing First research, while youth will be interviewed as part of the Restart project, there is a general need for Housing First research to gather service users' perspectives and experiences with receiving harm reduction in both Housing First and Housing First for Youth programming. In terms of recommendations for service delivery and practice, the first one here, given the purpose of this study, Housing First and Housing First for Youth program guiding documents and training materials need to provide more guidance on the implementation of harm reduction within these settings, more accurately outlining the role of harm reduction and the ways in which it was delivered. Two, given the tensions identified between age, empowerment, and harm reduction delivery in Housing First for Youth programs, these programs must address the power imbalances inherent to the Housing First for Youth model and the constraints that service providers may place on youth choice if we wish to see the promotion of true empowerment and harm reduction with youth experiencing homelessness and substance use issues. And lastly, and probably most importantly, more advocacy is needed from the nonprofit sector and policymakers for low barrier, youth oriented housing options for youth experiencing homelessness and active substance use issues in both Kelowna and other regions that are implementing Housing First for Youth. And then, just briefly before I end off, I wanted to highlight some of the changes that have been implemented in the Restart Project Kelowna site based on the insights that were gained from this study. So firstly, responding to one of those barriers to harm reduction delivery, the program has since removed the crime-free statement from rental agreements that prohibited substance use in order to use an approach that was more in line with harm reduction. And then similarly, the response to some of the challenges with housing youth in supportive housing buildings, the program has also been exploring more scattered site rentals or market rentals, obviously based on the availability of these units. So then to conclude and wrap up this presentation, the findings of this study demonstrated the practices and strategies used by service providers to deliver harm reduction to youth experiencing homelessness and concurrent disorders in the Restart Housing First for Youth program. In addition to addressing the knowledge gap on the implementation of harm reduction in Housing First for Youth, this study also uncovered systems-level barriers to harm reduction delivery, specifically the lack of housing availability for youth experiencing homelessness and substance use issues, emphasizing the need for greater advocacy for low-barrier housing options for youth who are actively using substances. To effectively practice harm reduction in Housing First for Youth, further research is needed to identify and address other contextual factors that may be promoting and limiting harm reduction delivery in Housing First for Youth programming. And yes, so thank you everyone for listening. There's my email there if anyone has any questions. And then obviously a big thank you to the Kelowna site. I think a few of the service providers are here for being a part of this. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Victoria. We're going to hold off for the Q&A at the end of the three presentations. Next, Jeff Nelson from Wilfrid Laurier University is going to talk about women and housing first. Yeah, let's see. Tim, there you go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone, and good morning to you. I'm going to talk about female participants in Housing First, and I'll be reporting on a qualitative analysis that was conducted from baseline to 18 months of outcomes for women in the context of a randomized controlled trial. So I'll say a little bit more about that as I go along. I also want to say that this is a project that was led, this analysis was led by Corinne Isaac and myself. Corinne's from Winnipeg, like these folks here, and she's the lead on the paper, but she wasn't able to attend the conference. So I've been elected to present on her behalf. We have a number of co-authors, including people sitting next to me here, but there's researchers from the 5 sites for the at-home Chez project on which this is based. I also want to make a couple of acknowledgments, and I want to acknowledge our colleague, Paula Gehring. Paula Gehring was the research lead for the at-home Chez project. She was our leader, and she was our friend and our mentor. And this research that I'm reporting on wouldn't be possible without Paula's leadership. I also want to make a land acknowledgement for this particular setting that we're in, that we're in Mi'kmaq, and it's the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So a little bit of background first. There's little research, particularly on women in Housing First. And what research there is that looks at outcomes doesn't tend to show many differences between the outcomes achieved by men and women. For example, Pat Ocampo and her colleagues, they did an analysis of the at-home Chez quantitative data. They didn't find too much difference in the outcomes reported for women as for men. But we know that women who are homeless experience a variety of different difficulties, challenges, intimate partner violence, exploitation, sexual abuse, trauma, child abuse, and parenting issues, particularly having their kids taken away and placed in the child welfare system. So these are some unique concerns that are more prevalent among women. We also know that Housing First has been and can be adapted specifically for women. And so the work by Chris Sullivan has looked at women who've been survivors of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and have been shown to be very successful with Housing First program and specific attention to their needs, having experienced intimate partner violence. Also, some people have argued that Housing First isn't a good fit for women, that they prefer congregate or supportive housing with other women. So I think we believe that that wasn't true, and also that probably housing first would have some impacts that wouldn't be detected by quantitative measures. So we decided to use the qualitative data from at home Chez, where we gathered interview data on people's stories at baseline and then again 18 months later. We thought that this approach would tell a fuller story about women's experiences. Not, as I said, not much has been done. There was a study that was done by and published by Abe Udshorn and colleagues, and they reported positive housing and social outcomes in a qualitative study of a program for women using Housing First. But we had this opportunity in the context of a trial to look at the outcomes experienced by women in Housing First and women who were experiencing treatment as usual using the qualitative methods. So we had two research questions. The first was, are life changes reported by female participants in Housing First? Did they report more life changes than those who were in treatment as usual? And if so, then what are those changes? What are the specific changes that they report? So this is how we did it. We kind of narrowed the whole at-home sample down. There were over 2,200 participants in the at-home research across the 5 cities, randomly assigned to Housing First or usual treatment. And we recruited, as part of the qualitative research, 219 people to do qualitative interviews to get more in-depth narratives. 74 of those identified themselves as female, hence the title of the paper. We're going by people's identification of themselves as female, and in 18 months. And we use this to answer the first question about life changes. So we had 42 people in Housing First, 22 in usual treatment. Then to look at the specific changes, question 2, we narrowed that down further to look at 45 participants, 23 Housing First and 22 in usual treatment. So we kind of whittled the sample down. The qualitative interviews were done, as I said, twice at baseline when project enrollment started, and then 18 months later. And what we did with those qualitative data is we actually quantified them to answer the first question, a simple procedure where we coded the changes as either being positive, mixed, neutral, or negative across, there were several life domains. And so we were able to do that and also reliably do that because we had a second coder who was able to give us an estimate of reliability of that particular coding. Then the second thing is we used a more traditional qualitative method to analyze the themes regarding life changes for those 45 female participants. So in each case, we compared Housing First and usual treatment. So this is the first question. Are the life changes reported by the female participants in Housing First? Are they reported more frequently than those in usual treatment? So you could look at this figure here, and the blue line, the blue bar is for positive changes. And you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, the Housing First participants. And the right-hand screen is usual treatment. So you can see that if we just look at positive changes, we've got more than 60% of those in Housing First report a positive changes overall, compared to 22% in usual treatment. As a matter of fact, the category that was most often characterized, the women in usual treatment, was negative changes. Things actually got worse, and that was 40%. So that's a statistically significant finding. that we've reported for this. I'm just put this one up here. I don't expect you to go through it because it's a lot of numbers, but it shows what this figure shows is there are 5 sites. All 5 sites report very similar findings. That is, women in Housing First report more positive changes than women in usual treatment. It's true in Moncton, it's true in Winnipeg, it's true in Toronto, it's true in every site. So the question then becomes that is of interest is, well, what are those changes that are being reported? And we came up with several. So the first one is enhanced safety. This was a big theme in the research. Females in Housing First reported feeling more safe and secure than females who were in usual treatment. A couple of quotes. The building's more secure and it's a lot nicer. Another person in Toronto says, I've had a supportive housing before, but I didn't feel like I was safe. And this is the first place like I feel like I love to go home. I love to go home. I feel safe, and safety is like major. Being safe is a major issue for me. Just worried about this guy here. I know he's going to pull a plug on me at something. I don't trust him anyway. Aubrey. Okay, a second theme is recovery in mental illness. So there's a distinction that's been made in the mental health recovery literature, which is it's a positive force in mental health, psychiatric rehabilitation, community mental health. There's a focus not on deficits and symptoms, but on recovery and getting a life. So there's a couple of different ways that term has been used, that concept. Recovery from means there's a reduction in symptoms. Mental health gets better. But there's another concept of recovery in mental illness. You still may be experiencing some symptoms, but you're making some other good changes in your life. And those things are plans, dreams, personal changes. And that was very evident in this analysis that we did with the women. So here's a person in Moncton who says, I know who I am and I'm developing like a person there. Just been, I don't know, there's just so many different points and details and stuff or whatever, but it's liberating as a female to live on my own. Another says, my life has changed drastically. I would say not so much materialistic wise, but how I view myself and the world I live in. I'm starting to feel I have something to offer. Okay. Another theme around the mental health is that females in Housing First report either no changes in their mental health or they don't report negative changes, whereas people in usual treatment oftentimes reported negative changes. So here's the participant, a woman in Housing First, and I'm sorry, she's in usual treatment in Winnipeg. And she writes, before school started, I tried to commit suicide again. Like an idiot, I was feeling horrible because I was homeless. Stupid things were happening. I had nowhere to go because I drank the night before. I still have depression. I have anxiety. My anxiety is getting worse. And I'm seeing a doctor. So we saw in the usual treatment, some people actually had deteriorated in terms of their perceptions about their own mental health. A fourth theme was reduced drug use. Women in Housing First reported reducing or eliminating drug use much more often than those who were in usual treatment. Here's another person from Winnipeg, says, pretty much I quit the drugs. Everything just kind of fell into place. There's a go in between for me there. I'm not the type of person that I can go and party, binge one day, and then not touch anything. I'm not that type of person. It's all tied up together. So you got to know what your boundaries are. Last theme was personal individualized changes. It didn't fit neatly into one category, but people made very idiosyncratic changes in their own lives to make their lives better. These could be things like taking up a hobby again or rekindling a hobby, um, having a pet that they were able to have when they were in their apartments. They also talked about their employment, their housing, and one person in Toronto says, I'm really proud of myself. With a lot of help, I was able to get back, not really back to where I used to be, but in a better place. So, overall, females in Housing First report more life changes than those in usual treatment, including experience of safety, recovery in mental illness, fewer negative changes in their mental health, reduced drug use, and personalized changes. So just say a couple of things about making sense about this. So the safety, I think, is a very big issue, and I relate this to what Deborah Paget called in a paper that she wrote in Social Science and Medicine back a while ago. She called this ontological security. And ontological security is a sense of stability and wellness that people have. And I think the safety of having your own place is a really important component of that. It's having a life where you feel safe and secure. The mental health recovery, I think, is important because serious mental illness is very difficult to overcome, but it doesn't mean you can't get a life. And many people in this study, in this particular analysis, reported getting their lives back or getting a different life than they had before and preventing a deterioration in mental illness. Third is the drug use, which was, oh, I got 5 minutes. I'm feeling good. Okay. This is very similar to what Deborah Paget reported in another study where she looked at qualitative data and she compared housing first and treatment or treatment as usual. And she found evidence of reduced drug use, which is kind of interesting because sometimes on these studies, like the overall at home, I don't think they reported drug use dropped, right? That hasn't been a consistent outcome. But when we dig into these qualitative data, these women did talk about getting a better handle on it. And it doesn't always mean giving up drugs. It means having more control over it. And the last is the individualized changes. And what I'll say about this is very consistent with how Sam Sambaris originally conceptualized housing first, is that it's not a cookie cutter approach. It's a very person specific, individualized approach. We talk with each person about their goals, what they want, what changes do they envision for themselves? And we saw that in this study. It could be something simple like, you get a pet or you start playing the piano again or something. It depends on the individual. Last is the implications for practice. So while people women benefit from housing first, I think more could be done to introduce a gender-centered lens to enhance practices regarding women. And I think one for sure that more attention should be paid or it should become routine practice in a Housing First program to inquire with women about the experience of intimate partner violence and help people to escape that or to recover from that. We know that that's possible, and that has been adapted in Chris Sullivan and others' work. Finally, I think we need to pay more attention to the exploitation, abuse, trauma, and child abuse than is currently the case. Women experience a lot of adverse life events. They have had those experiences and they continue to have, and those should become front and center. And then last, I think it's important to address parenting issues for women and parent-child reconciliation. And that, I think, is the end, and it's going to be the segue to what Gino and Betty are going to talk about. So there's some information here about how you can contact me, the Mental Health Commission's final report on at home, our toolkit, and also, if you're interested, our Housing First Network, which we're going to be talking with you more about tomorrow. Please come to our session. Thank you.
I always like a shameless plug on that. And you kept it within 20 minutes, Joe. Teach an old dog new tricks, eh? That's the thing. Um, Gino, is there, Betty, the slides? Are they on here? Or? Let me just check. Okay. Is that in?
Might just be moved and scrolled up.
Oh, they're on the desktop. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay. There we go. Okay. So next, Gino DeStazio, University of Winnipeg, and Betty Adele from End Homelessness Winnipeg. We'll talk about the parent-child relationship in the context of housing first for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Right.
Good morning, everyone. Let me just start by saying, Betty and I come from Winnipeg. We're from Treaty 1, which is the homeland of many First Nations communities, birthplace and homeland of the Métis Nation, and a place where Inuit persons and communities also come, meet, and use those territories. We also find ourselves in the inner city of Winnipeg, where much of this work has taken place over the last number of decades. And so I'm honored to be here today and certainly very honored to have Betty with me presenting. As Jeff mentioned, one of our the lead on the paper, Rachel Kaplan, couldn't be here. So Jeff asked if I would present the paper that we're all on. And then I instinctively asked Betty as well. So what we'll talk about today is a little bit about us, a little bit about the study, some of the findings, and then I think what now? Like, what does this research mean? I mean, we often present a lot of this work, and it's sort of important to try to set that. It's also important to note that work like this and the work that's been spoken of today, especially that comes from the At Home Chez project, which is now getting close to 15 years. So, I mean, there's been hundreds of papers, hundreds, if not more, presentations at conferences. I'm not sure what the attendance was this morning, but it looked like 1,000 people packed into that room. And I think back to the first conference, or even when we were kicking off the At Home project back in 2008 with trying to get our head around what we were going to do. At that point, there was really no understanding of housing first in Canada, and we've come a long way in understanding. And even till today, we're still drawing from some of that material, but still facing a lot of the same barriers to see more people become stably housed. So the research that I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to say something. It's a little odd for me to present on just a paper. And so I think between Betty and I, we've kind of sandwiched the paper within some of our own experiences in hope that even though the project today is about 5 cities, we're going to set it within a bit more of a Winnipeg context. And I hope that really helps set some of the discussion between we kind of think some of the findings mean. I was going to start, and I still will start with who we are. Well, sorry, still in a goofy, not existentially, but um, so I've been a applied geographer for getting on to 25 years and done most of my work in the inner city. But I wanted to just take a moment to pause and show you a picture. This is my dad. And I'm showing it, not, I wouldn't normally show it other than, I was thinking I was coming into Halifax and this is where my dad's journey started coming in from Italy, like so many immigrants before. So I certainly walked by the pier. And I know we have time, but I'll just share one thing that has stuck with me because he said to me, when he came to Canada on a boat and arrived here in Halifax, had very little money. He said something, I don't know, this always stuck with me. He said, unlike his friends, he walked across the street and picked up some groceries in a bag and got back on the train. And all his friends sort of had not enough money to eat on the train because it was a lot more expensive than picking up groceries. And I don't know why that's just stuck with me for the last 55 years. Again, I'm very pleased, and Betty can introduce herself, but I call Betty certainly a friend and a mentor, and I've learned a lot from her over the years in terms of some of the work that we've done, and so I'll leave it to her to introduce herself. But um, also, really, I'm not going to go quickly, but I will say that it's important that we do recognize the path to reconciliation also means acknowledging the harms of colonialization, the residential school framework, the 1960s scoop and adoption policies, the ongoing harms of provincial child and family policies, and that there continues to be in places like Winnipeg and I suspect elsewhere systemic racism and barriers to the housing market that really still continue to present challenges beyond what we're trying to do as anyone. And we have to not only acknowledge, but we have to put into play the calls to action, and we have to do things differently as a country and as communities. We also recognize too in the work that we do in Winnipeg and even through the At Home project and work today is that homelessness through an Indigenous lens is experienced differently. And I know that most of us here probably acknowledge Jesse Thistle's work in describing that perspective in homelessness and just the connections that make it distinctive. And Betty will pick up a bit on that as we really come to understand some of the unique experiences. The Winnipeg context becomes really important for us in sharing that Winnipeg is home to the largest urban Indigenous population in Canada. It's a growing, strong, resilient, capacity-filled community that is doing tremendous good in the community. We still see an overrepresentation within the population experiencing homelessness, and that continues to drive the great work that organizations like End Homelessness continue to do and countless others. As has been already raised, this work is part of the At Home Chez project that for a period of time tried to change the paradigm in 5 cities for how we can address homelessness. And it's interesting that 15 years later, we still kind of go back and forth, sort of wavering on whether or not housing first is the way forward or whether or not it's a range. And as Jeff and others have mentioned in the At Home project, we did have a large sample that we worked with a significant number of people, and I would be remiss in not saying that of the 2,150 persons enrolled in that project in 2009, we lost a significant number of individuals during the study and continue to lose individuals. And their spirits and their stories and their words and their experience become important as we share today. And it saddens me in a way that many passed away because of circumstances that we probably had much more control of. So the current study, and again, I'll try to move through this as quick as I can. So one of the interesting parts that we wanted to look back and try to understand in the at-home study parents who were separated from their children during the project and up to the project, but we didn't know much about it. So when we looked into the data, we zeroed in on 43 people that had experiences with children. And what we wanted to do was understand whether or not Housing First had a positive impact on the parent-child relationship, and whether or not there was some distinctions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous parents, and also those who received Housing First and those who were in the care as usual kind of system. So for us, it was kind of a unique way to take a look back at the data. But again, we are looking back in a time capsule. So everything I talk about occurred upwards of 15 years ago. But I still think that there's a lot of merit in understanding the importance of this work. And in terms of some positive findings, overall parents did find positive changes in their relationships with children. And I think that this was a good thing in Housing First. And learning from the approach in Winnipeg, we really had a focus and a centering on both community and family reunification. And this really became an interesting part of this project because a lot of the participants that were drawn into this study actually came from Winnipeg, especially the Indigenous parents. And while the good was that Housing First saw positive outcomes in that relationship, we know that persons experiencing homelessness that were in the usual care system continue to struggle. And, in looking back at it, and I don't want to, we do signal out some persons, but, in a quote from Henry, a father, speaking of his son coming over, he came over to visit, and it was the biggest part of my day in the whole 7-year period since he had last really spent time with him. And another father saying how now that I have him back, I feel more reason to live and more purpose. And all of us, I think, can take something from the experience. Those of us that have children, relationship, often can be strained, but there can be nothing that replaces the importance and centrality of family. And we know that Housing First does support community integration, relationship formation. We think there's more to be done. And again, unfortunately, what we've seen over the last number of decades is the increasing presence of families experiencing homelessness, of parents, singles, and with children experiencing homelessness. And we can draw the positive of that family reunification, but step one is still the provision of adequate housing, quality housing, and the supports necessary to really bring that family back together and to do so in a good way. Like the other folks that have spoken, there are limitations. This was a small sample, but again, we still feel that there is really important work to be done to bring families back together, to address some of those systemic harms, the long-term impacts of some of these deep traumas that families and individuals face as their path to recovery and housing stability come on board. I'm going to ask Betty to kind of come up and kind of talk through some of these thoughts through kind of a Winnipeg lens that we think lends to the bigger story. Not that Winnipeg did it distinctively, but I think we did. But I think there's a lot to be learned from the Winnipeg experience. So Betty, thank you.
So we just prepared this on Friday and Gino prepared it and I told him I didn't know if I was going to do any of his PowerPoint. So I'm just going to say that. So I think things need to be put in context. Winnipeg was the only city in Canada that we did our work from an Indigenous perspective. And I think that is why our results are different in Winnipeg than in other cities. I want to acknowledge Darlene Hall and Josie Hill, and the three of us got together. I'm a Red River Métis citizen, and so is Josie, and so is Darlene Hall. So we knew that all the work we did had to come from an Indigenous perspective because we understand pathways in BC, but we're Indigenous people on our land still, with our teaching still, so it had to be modified. for us in the way we look at the world, right? So when we set ours up, we actually went to the people first. We have a place called Thunderbird House in Winnipeg, and we brought in the people who were experiencing houselessness, and we said, hey, we might get some money. This is what it's for. What are we going to do with it? So we had a big feast, and then we broke up into little groups and we talked about, okay, if this money comes, what do you as the community, what are you looking for to see what results we need from this work, right? So from that, we had an elders council together. So it was the elders who were giving us guidance on the work that we were doing. We had 3 sites, and the unique thing about that is we didn't individually put in our own perspective. We combined them together. I was at that time the CEO of Mount Carmel Clinic, so it was a big clinic in the North End. Josie was the ED at the Mama Wichita Center, and Darlene at Aboriginal Health and Wellness. So we each did something unique and different, but we all had something in common. And when we pulled in an elder, we had to do, we used the perspective of when the researchers brought people in, but all of us looked from our historical perspective and what was going on in the lives of people. So we knew that if we didn't understand the people in front of us and the history through the generations, that we would not produce something good, right? So we talked, when we did conversations with people, we would ask them, what are your dreams? What are your hopes? Right? And then we would say, where do you want to be housed? And we would talk about people's history. We would say, where are you from? Are you still connected to your community? What support do you get from your community? So we didn't only look at formal supports, we looked at informal supports in the community. What we quickly realized, not surprisingly, is that when we talked to especially the mothers, there was a lot of misinformation about their rights. So when we would ask the mothers, what's your plans? What do you want to do? Do you have, are your children with you? Do how often do you visit them? Do you want to reconnect? And consistently we heard that they're apprehended. And so they thought they didn't have the right to see their children. So it's not that people didn't want to be with their children, it's they thought they didn't have the right to. So when we started on that journey of talking to them, but yeah, you do have the right to, but let's talk about how you want this to work, because we don't want to push people and make them feel guilty that you should do something or push them too far ahead. So we had those conversations with people about what made sense to them. And that was important when we were talking about housing, right? So we're getting a 1-bedroom, a bachelor, we're getting a 2-bedroom. We had advocacy for the parents, because I don't think the system was used to advocates going to the meetings with people and saying, no, we need to start up these visits and this is how it needs to happen, and that. We also talked about the parenting programs, because all the parenting programs we had in Winnipeg was from a very colonized perspective. And what we really realized is that a lot of people are walking around with shame and guilt. I'm part of the CFS system and aged out into homelessness too. So I brought all those experiences with me of my family and life. So we just like really had a good conversation. And it's not about only the individual. We have to look at the systems and how we got here, right? Because then we all walk around with guilt and shame. Like, I thought I was going to make the difference. I thought I would keep all my children together. I thought I wouldn't be like my mom or my grandma and that, right? So we have to like we really talk to them about, but what is it in the systems that separation and disconnect from community and disconnect from family and being imposed of what is the right way to parent and how you need to think in that. And then we realized that a lot of it was around hopelessness also, because parents would be assigned to go to a lot of parenting courses, which they would do, but their children still wouldn't be brought back. And it would be just one more thing, one more thing, one more thing, but the children never come back, right? So, okay. I never pay attention to time either, but okay. So it was just a way of really understanding who's in front of you, not at this moment, but at the journey and all the things that happened in people's lives. Like we had to look at it that way because we wanted to take away that it's your fault as an individual, it was your choices, but not connecting to what was going on, right? So initially, when we talked about it, we had a psychiatrist at one site and a psychologist at another site, but we said we want an elder there because we need to have sharing circles. We need to talk about that. We need to not, yes, it's part of our own healing journey, but it's in the context of colonialism and racism and oppression, like and discrimination. So we had those conversations about that, and we walked with people through feelings of I'm not good enough and I can't do this, because for years always being told you have to go take this course, this course, this course, this course, but it's still not good enough. You still can't parent your children. So we spent a lot of time on that, and we also spent time with our staff on being self-aware that we all come in with biases and beliefs about something from our worldview of how we experienced it. So just to be aware, like it drives me nuts when people say non-judgmental. Yeah, we all are. I'm sorry, we are. We all have a lens of how we view the world and how we make decisions. So there's nothing wrong with that, but we just really wanted people to be aware of that. Be aware of when you're communicating with someone, you're bringing something into that conversation, and it's your belief of how things should be. So I think the good part of that journey was yes, we're all responsible individually, but it was about reciprocity. It was about, well, we're not here to fix you in that. We have stuff in our journey that we need to be aware of. And how are we all in this together and moving from being, independent and then to dependence. And then we pushed more for let's be interdependent. We're all here to help each other. You don't need to do this on your own, right? We're part of a community. How do we work together? And it's okay to talk about things, because when you don't talk about things, that's when things get worse. Secrets make things worse. So how can we make people feel free enough to share their struggles so that we can help them stay together and we can normalize it? We all struggle with something. So how do we normalize that and have those conversations? So I think that's why Winnipeg was unique in that way, that we came at it from a whole world perspective and we interconnected stuff, and we didn't look at it like we're here to fix you or make things better. We're here to acknowledge the reality of your lives and what you're facing every day, and how can we work on this together. So in a nutshell, that was Winnipeg. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Betty and Gino. We've got some time. It's a group of presenters that we're very vigilant about time, so we can do a Q&A. Is there a microphone that gets passed around? Is that right? No? So you'll have to just be loud and when you have a question. So let's questions. I'll open the floor now. Question.
Uh, I was wondering, that the impact will be able to this, but I was in better office for the game because I was like not voting.
So you're wondering if the issue of disability was taken up in the research? That's the question?
Much something like That's your belly.
What was the focus on it? Okay. Can you understand? Do you want to?
It was about disability.
Yeah. Is it factored in? Yeah, into the research.
I don't recall, maybe there was something that we did around looking at disabilities on that. But I mean, my overall answer to this and thought about it was, in the disabilities field, you know, the concept of independent living is a strong concept. And, it came from Sweden and it's been promoted across North America. The whole idea of independent living, the independent living centers, it's very congruent with housing first because it's all about getting people their own place and about individual empowerment, individual choice. What do individuals want? That's your career. I think independent living and housing first feed one another. In the origins of housing first, it started off with a person named Paul Carling before Samson Barris. And he was very interested, very motivated by the disability rights movement. And he thought, it's all about getting your own place, getting your own life, individual choice, not putting people in a big block apartment, with other people with disabilities. It's about where do you want to live and how can we bring the support to you to enable you to do what you want. Having trouble hearing you.
Were there other comments from the presenters?
Yeah, I just want to share the at-home Chez research in Winnipeg. I can just speak of Winnipeg. A lot of the people were recruited by, we had people come and interview them. So I would say most of those people were sheltered people, like living in shelters. And I'm sure you know that shelters aren't a good place for people who are struggling with stuff. So I don't honestly remember. I wasn't part of the interviews of who got in and who didn't. But in all the programs, I don't remember anyone concentrating on disability in that research study that we're talking about now.
And just one last comment on that, again, just from our perspective, the challenge too was in even just thinking about mobility was the problem of housing quality in a place like Winnipeg, where we still have a disproportionate number of three-story walk-ups or duplexes or triplexes that aren't overly accessible. So it always limits the pool when we're really trying to find quality, barrier-free, accessible housing. So it's something I think you're right in pushing. We're not there. We're not there.
And I just want to add, I think it's really good that you brought it up because this whole session is about adapting housing first. And the adaptation to people with disabilities is a good fit. It's not going to be one where, oh gee, how do those things go together? Those are two approaches that are very congruent with one another, and they deserve more attention, like Gino says. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, just to carry on, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think when you think about an aging population where disabilities are required, with individuals who are homeless who will acquire certain adaptations, I mean, that we should all be pushing for any publicly funded supports be fully and totally accessible none of this 1 in 10, 2 in 10, it should be 10 in 10. Because people's needs change, population's changing, we need to be able to, rather than say, sorry, this doesn't fit you anymore, where are we gonna put you, type thing, is housing first is housing first. You're here, you can age in place, you can stay here, be safe, get the supports that you need. So I think the push for research specific to that, I think, is greatly needed, given the changing needs of the demographic across our country. And that brings me to my kind of question in regards to your study on women. Did you capture their age range in terms of who you spoke to?
Yeah.
Part of your survey? Yeah.
Yeah, we had a whole range of people. We had from young people, like the age range that Victoria was talking about, to women who were in their 50s or older. So it was a whole range of women who were in that particular study. Just like with the men, the age range was very similar.
And interestingly, age ranges have different experiences.
Absolutely.
Someone her age versus an older individual in terms of perspective, and sometimes where you are dictates how you actually tell people how you're feeling and what you're actually experiencing. So I mean, rather than lumping it in part as a suggestion was part of the research, but also look at the difference and perspective of younger women versus older women. When we think of women that are escaping violence, intimate partner violence, or just violence and abuse, could very well have been someone who's endured it for 30 years.
Yes.
And I hate using that word endure because it's basically as a result of the system is not actually allowing that. But their perspective and what does it mean for them to be in housing first and get the support they need is quite different. So it'd be nice to try to do a bit of resources for that. Yeah.
Good idea.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
First of all, I'm not piling on, but 30% of folks in shelters have developmental disabilities,
Yeah.
and none of that's been addressed in any of these
That's
settings.
good.
Yeah.
But I came to this one because I'm interested in finding out from the panel what you would say are the key factors that, in your wisdom, could be utilized to adapt housing first to other populations that you haven't covered today. What are the key things that help your research be successful that we can learn from and adapt and build into our work?
Go ahead. Use the microphone, Betty, please, just for people at the back.
I guess for me, the biggest thing is to reach out to the people that you're going to be working with and ask them, what do you see? What is your hope? What would make sense to you? What do you want it to look like? What do you not want part of it? What do you want to make sure is part of it? Right? Instead of having a plan of what we can do for people. I think that made the biggest difference is gathering the people together at first. And we have this opportunity. You tell us what would make sense to you and what will make a difference in your life from your experiences. So I would recommend doing that first, going to the people and asking them.
I'm going to add to that because one of the things that I recalled strongly in Winnipeg was, there was some good tension, right? The community, Indigenous community, non-Indigenous community, researchers, psychiatry, it wasn't necessarily always pleasant, but it was important. And I say that always in a very positive, respectful way that we pushed each other to learn from each other. But then, I use the term to localize it because we said, again, in things like in Winnipeg, it wasn't just going to be a static kind of model that didn't respect and really bring the principles that Betty spoke to into the work that we're doing, including, and I was on the research end. And so as Betty talks about elders, we had a community member sit in every single interview. And we were also trying to deal with a randomized controlled trial that was really kind of compartmentalized, and we just kept pushing. But I think in the bigger context, it was Housing First provides a framework. That framework doesn't limit you to really exploring, embracing local characteristics of a population or a community through different lenses. Again, in ours, having an elders council and all the things that went on were just the things that we do in Winnipeg that might be distinctive from another population. But I say the more the better.
Thank you. And I should preface, I'm a new researcher in the field. Obviously, these people have way more experience and thoughts than I do, and I work predominantly with youth. But I think to shout out what Betty was saying and what Jeff had mentioned earlier, like housing first isn't meant to be this cookie cutter approach. And I do a lot of community work, and I think, that's where the expertise comes from. And so asking the communities that you're working with what they want and what needs they have, and really tailoring your programs to the people that you're specifically working with, I think is the most important part of this. Obviously we do research on this and we read about it, and many of you work with these communities and these people experiencing homelessness, wherever they come from and whatever walk of life and whatever experience they bring. But, they have the expertise. We could spend whatever many hours we want, but, they're the ones who know what they need and what their goals are. And I think that really focusing on that individualized support and really tailoring your programs to that is probably what I would say is something to really, really focus on.
Does that help, Parker? No, wait. Thanks.
Good.
I just want to add one more thing to that. When we were doing this, as Gino said, there was a lot of tension, but we invited the people to the table because when this first came to Winnipeg, the offer was made to the shelters to operate housing first. And the Indigenous community, I think we got everyone together in 2 days. And we met at the Friendship Center, and there's about 100 people there. And we said, absolutely not. Like, that is not happening here. And so we clearly told them what would happen. But well, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, we didn't exclude the people. When we had the table, the shelters were invited to the table, the police were invited to the table, like all the people that may not necessarily be viewed in a good ally way. We didn't exclude them because how are we going to be in relationship if we just push everyone out? It was about relationship and having those hard discussions, not saying something and I'm never going to talk to you again and you have some assets or resources we want, but now you're not going to talk to me, right? It's how do we bring those things together and build a relationship so we can get some understanding happening and just work in a different way with each other.
Great. And if I could mention Winnipeg, Betty and Gino and their collaborators have put together a wonderful document on the Indigenous approach to housing first. It really reflects how the model can be adapted. The other thing is, another shameless plug. Tomorrow, we're doing a session on fidelity. Catherine Gibb, Wally Check, I think you probably know both of those people, and myself. It's it's a mini workshop on fidelity, but we're going to talk about adaptation because there's always that balance between what's the framework and how do you adapt it, given the population, given the context, and so on. Questions? Lee?
Farmers again. But I really like I thought all states very comprehensive with interesting. I'd like to that for Jeff. In terms of I was curious, I don't know so much about it, but I looked on the stats, 60.8% copy painted housing birds for women that were talking about their life changes, how that caused the impact on, and 22.7% negative changes. Sorry, and the point is there was lots of positive change in terms of life, the well-being, the plus your health. So this demonstrates that housing first can be beneficial. That's demonstrated to be beneficial for that selected target group, demographic of women. And if so, I'm sorry, I don't follow record. That's would be beneficial.
Would it be beneficial? I'm sorry.
Sorry, with the housing first approach for women that in terms of their life changes, like it's been positive for them.
Yes.
So that's I guess what I'm getting at is how come it's not adopted more for this particular group?
in terms of like, is it because there's more resources that need to be applied for it, like case managers, like Team HA was being case managers, group therapy, that type of thing? Or is like you want to put funding for that? Or is it because I'm just curious for why it's not adopted?
Yeah. The scale up question. Use the microphone. Jeff. You have something to say about that?
That's a $64,000 question. If we had an answer to that, we'd be making a lot of headway a lot faster. And I think people get distracted. They develop their own approaches, or they look at something and they don't look at what the research has said about how effective this is. I mean, there people make assertions that this isn't the right approach for women. And that was my motivation for taking a look back at those data is just didn't buy it. I think women, the women I've talked to and read transcripts from, they really got their lives together with housing first. And they dealt with some of those specific issues, that women experience that much more than men. And this whole business around reconciling with your kids and it wasn't just the kids, it was the whole community, right? It was reconnecting with your roots and having a pride in being, an Indigenous person, Indigenous woman, Indigenous mother, getting your kids back. And Housing First was a vehicle for that. So we wanted to get that message out there. So other people can take up that cause and further develop it.
There was I just at the back. Was there somebody that? Okay. Yep. Yeah.
Regarding full perspective, what would that like? So I'm just interested, I think Victoria and Jack, if you can provide some insight on the involvement of participants in the development of programming and service provision and the, I guess looking at key effectiveness on the market.
Do you want to start?
Want to go?
Sure.
Start.
So the study that I presented was just like a very, very small part of a much larger project that's still going on right now in Kelowna and in Toronto. And so there is a youth advisory committee that has been part of, and it is youth with lived experience, that, were recruited and expressed interest in being part of, not only designing the project, but they help with absolutely everything, and everything, even my presentation goes to them to be essentially like reviewed and approved, if you want to summarize it that way. And so they were there for the start of the project, for the writing of the funding applications and the things. They were there even when it came to recruitment materials and interview guides. Like everything is reviewed by those youth to make sure, not only are we being cognizant of their experiences, but also, not including anything that could be harmful or problematic. But another thing is, obviously, and as you all know, like just because you set out to run a program a certain way, it doesn't always work out that way. And so there have been plenty of challenges along the way. And if my supervisor, Mark Kirst, was here, she would let you know there's been plenty of fires to put out with this project, and I'm sure there will continue to be. But that's where that youth advisory committee really comes in to ask them, how would you approach this? Really get their input and get their feedback. And another thing that we found, even just from the broader evaluation of how the program was being implemented, we asked youth, like, what feedback do you have? And a big thing that service providers had mentioned is that, we need more youth feedback. Like, yes, we're getting a little bit of it, but in these programs, we need to hear from the youth, and I'm sure any population that you're applying Housing First with, you need to hear that feedback of if the programs are working with them. So I think that sort of answered your question, that there is a lot of nothing about us without us, and specifically the Restart program. Like they've been there every step of the way, and they'll be there even now as we start to talk about like sharing a lot of the knowledge that we found. Like they'll be a big part of that as well.
As far as the staffing of Housing First programs and using people, having people with lived experience involved, that's a basic component of all the assertive community treatment programs. They have to have a person with lived experience as a staff member providing support. And many of the case management programs have that too. But this is probably more of a question for Betty because the three Indigenous programs, they did this a lot.
So I would say the biggest lesson that I often reflect on when there's a lot of conversation about peer support, and I've looked at that and we've talked about how do we know when someone's far enough on their journey so we're not traumatizing them again, right? And so I really come to the belief, as a person with lived experience myself, of just hire staff and look at the qualifications. And if one of the qualifications is that you have that experience, because then you're not giving them a special title, right? And you're not focusing on you're the expert in this, because then you're locking people into that part of their life. And that's the only important thing about you is that part of your life, right? But with all of us, we have experiences in our lives that help shape who we are, but we're not locked into that. And that's the only worthwhile thing about us is that we've been through this, right? So that's what we often talk about as we walk, what we walked away with is just to make sure that everyone's included and what they have experienced will that bring value to the team and what's needed versus just hiring one person to be the expert in something, right? Versus we all bring something that we can contribute, and you should look at that as part of your team, right? Not setting someone up and locking them into that part of their life, and that's the only worthwhile thing about them, and that's the only thing of value that people will honor. So.
There was a question, yeah, at the front here, David.
So that's your question. I just wanted to, if Housing First has got these, is showing to be really successful, you know, why are we leaving it up to non-profits and other agencies to implement it? Why is that not being fed to government and then shared and backed by government at policy? Why is that? They're the one funding a lot of non-profits. And, why are we carrying on doing things that are not proven to be as successful as the Housing First model or other models? I just don't, that doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense to me. And I say this row is the $64,000 question row because those are great questions. Why are we not basing our homelessness policy and programs on housing first? And I think what we've seen, we're going to present this tomorrow. We've done a survey of the housing first programs in Canada. When the federal government did mandate that 60% or more of the funding goes into housing first programs in that period after at home Chez, when they reviewed what used to be called the homelessness partnering strategy, they had to. And we saw growth in housing first in Canada. That was dropped. And we see a drop in housing first. So it's a really good question. How do we reinvigorating it? There is a session where we're talking about a network of housing first and how we can really expand that and have influence. It's about education. It's about lobbying. Um, it's about a lot of things that are really tough, to achieve.
It really, I struggle with it because we are in such a housing crisis. Why are all the highly paid ministers not looking at best practice? Why are they not doing that?
You gonna come to our session tomorrow? We no, we want you.
Maybe one last comment.
I know, coming from my background, in terms of infrastructure and the housing crisis, she had just didn't talk about how does that impact your guys' work? And then we're talking about wraparound programs, having spaces where they can access, talking to the elders or spiritual centers or wellness centers.
Yes.
How does that impact you guys in the work that we do?
So I think another big lesson we learned when we walked away, housing first focus on scattered site, right? And that's a very colonized view of housing, right? So how we're looking at housing is it's on a continuum, right? Choice isn't only choice of what area of the city you live in. Choice is what supports are around you. So after at home Chez, we pulled in the women serving organizations and where I work at End Homelessness Winnipeg, and we said, well, what kind of housing would make sense? And so it was a big apartment block where there was communal access to it. Plus, everyone had their own places, right? So it was an option to go back and forth, and there would be an elder as part of that, right? So that's our lesson from At Home Chez Soi. Some people will want individual housing in scattered sites. Some people, if that's not their culture and their history, that is not what they're interested in. And I can tell you in At Home Chez Soi, in the perspective we got in Winnipeg, is transitional housing was like a really bad word, right? But if you've been incarcerated for a while, or if you've been living in shelters for a while, and then just to move you all by yourself in a place, and now you have to cook and you have to do laundry and that, like we really look back, okay, would we do it that way again? And I can tell you we wouldn't do it that way again, right? Because now we've learned, and we've had people in shelters come up and talk in meetings and say, stop doing that to us. We'll tell you when we're ready to live in a place. So we need to listen to what people are telling us. So I think we need to look at housing on a continuum. And yeah, and then again, we need to ask the people, okay, so what's the trends, what's the needs, and then build housing that way, right?
Great. Okay. That's a wrap. It's time for lunch. Just to note, I'm to remind everyone there's a recording of the
Tim.
session. Sorry? Oh, okay. Well, we can manage one more. Sure. Sorry.
It was I think it's a little bit of both. So the program was specifically a housing first program for youth. And the program, what it's trying to do is adapt housing first, not only for youth, but youth experiencing mental health and concurrent substance use issues. And so what I was trying to do is look at what does harm reduction look like in that program in general. So are they being offered adult services? Are they being youth specific for services like for substance like just what does it look like? And I think so I don't have an exact maybe response for you. I think it's just in general, what does harm reduction look like in this program? What does it look like in this context? Like what are youth being offered when they're using substances and want to access clean needles or want to access detox, like those sorts of things? I think with because we were partnered with CMHA Kelowna and they were the ones offering it, I think the services that were obviously being given to youth were more youth focused rather than obviously adult focused. But I think just the important part is that they just, these services need to be offered and available to youth in whatever capacity that we can manage right now. And it was just kind of exploring that, like, what are they accessing? And obviously, it was from a service provider's perspective, unfortunately, and we haven't been able to speak to the youth yet. But I'm hoping that we'll get that perspective eventually and be like, okay, so, what are you accessing? Are you accessing adult services? Are you accessing, youth services? Like, what's going on here? That's the part that's still missing, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll get it soon.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. So thank you to the presenters for a great presentation. Thanks to you for your engagement. There are recordings of the session that'll be available same day or next day on the conference web-based on-demand platform. So enjoy lunch and the rest of the conference. Thank you.